My name is Bob Newton. I'm Special Assistant to the President of Boston College, Father Leahy, and I'm the Interim Director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, which is co-sponsoring tonight's event with the BC Theology Department. We started the Church in the 21st Century Initiative in 2002 as Boston College's response to the clerical sexual abuse crisis in the church, and here, especially here in Boston. And over the past 8 years, we've held how many programs, invited hundreds of people like Professor Lakeland to come and speak to audiences here at Boston College. We have a very robust website. We publish C21 resources, which you can find on the table back there. And one of the things we've done, which is perhaps not as obvious to all of you, is we published a book series, the C21 Book Series. And in a brief conversation with Professor Lakeland, I reminded him that I'd met him almost 8 years ago at the beginning of the C21 initiative, when he came as one of our speakers to a conference that focused on church ethics, the organizational context, where he was one of the speakers and ultimately one of the contributors to a volume of that same title. So I'd like to welcome him back at this end of the C21 initiative, and now call upon our distinguished Professor Emeritus of our Theology Department, Father Robert Daly, to introduce Professor Lakeland.
I have the distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Paul Lakeland. He holds the Aloysius P. Kelly Chair in Catholic Studies at Fairfield University. I've known him for a number of years and have always found what he has to say to be interesting, insightful, and beautifully presented. He has his degrees from Heathrow Pontifical Athenaeum, Oxford University, the University of London, and Vanderbilt University. He's the author of some 35 articles and 8 books, among them The Liberation of the Laity in Search of an Accountable Church, 2003, Catholicism at the Crossroads, How the Laity Can Save the Church, and there's a dot job, 2007, and Church Living Communion, 2009. Now, his next book is provisionally, that he's currently working on, is provisionally entitled Wrestling with Ignatius. But right now, I'm very much looking forward to hearing him speak to us on the vocation of the church, one calling, many roles. Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for the nice introduction. Can you all hear me? Yes. Yeah, great. The vocation of the church, one calling, many roles. I was just thinking as Bob read the list of book titles there, I always feel like I have to apologize or explain for the one that he commented on, Catholicism at the Crossroads, How the Laity Can Save the Church. That was not my preferred subtitle. I had originally intended it would be called Catholicism at the Crossroads, Why the Laity Must Step Up to the Plate, which is somewhat different, but I was told by the publisher that this really wouldn't do because it was going to have an English edition and they didn't understand baseball metaphors. So we went with that title, and I cannot tell you how much trouble it has caused me over the years. So today, the vocation of the church, one calling, many roles. It has not been at all the practice in Christian churches to talk as if there is one single vocation of all the baptized. As you undoubtedly know, for very many years, the Catholic Church has used the term vocation largely to refer to ordained ministry and to religious life. There's a vocation to the priesthood, to the diaconate, and to orders of men and women in what has also been called consecrated life. That has left the rest of us with no vocation. The young man who entered the seminary and departed after a couple of years might say, on reflection, I thought I had a vocation, but I didn't. The former novice nun likewise. Ex-priests were often said, some years ago now I think, to have lost their vocations. What you may also know is that the churches of the Protestant Reformation rejected the idea that vocation was a term reserved to priesthood and religious life, and indeed largely rejected the idea of religious life altogether. In making this break, they admitted the rest of us to the ranks of those with a calling, but they also greatly expanded the number of vocations there might be, so that in the end, your vocation came to be understood to be the job or the profession you had, so long as you lived it out faithfully in the context of a Christian life. God had called you to be a teacher or a carpenter, and it was your Christian duty to be the best possible teacher or carpenter you could be. And while the idea of doing your best has some Christian spiritual potential, over time it often came to mean that if you simply did your job, you were responding to God's call, and that was the end of that. This way lay the later Calvinist association of piety and good, even sharp, business practice. What I want to do this evening, is explore the idea that we've been considerably wrong-headed, Catholic and Protestant alike, in our use of the idea of vocation or calling. Because this is pretty much a Catholic audience and I'm a Catholic theologian, I will concentrate on the Catholic Church. But in fact, both Catholics and Protestants have something to teach one another, and both have deficiencies that are the shadow side of their strengths. The Catholic tradition, in its focus on ordination or religious vows, has preserved the sense that a vocation is somehow something considerably more than the job you do, but at the price of abandoning 95% of the baptized to the ranks of those who do not have a vocation. Protestantism overcame that problem and has much to teach us in that regard, but it also removed the sense that we are called to something more than just being a plumber or being a pope. On the other hand, there can surely be a saintly plumber and a sinful pope. So first, let me reflect a little bit on the meaning of church, and then spend another little bit of time thinking about the calling to the baptismal priesthood. After that, I want to turn to a series of questions that concern Catholics about the nature of ordained ministry and what that might mean for the work of those who minister in other ways. And I'll conclude with some thoughts about how the Church of the fairly immediate future might benefit by exploring this somewhat different understanding of vocation and maybe even adjusting its structures of ministry to reflect it. The underlying assumption of this presentation is that the natural, almost instinctive understanding of Catholics that the Church is composed of clergy and laity is deeply unhelpful and, if not actually theologically dubious, arguably socially and structurally harmful. The word church is an unhappy choice of words to translate the Greek ecclesia, at least if we wish to have any good sense of the original meaning of the term. The ecclesia is the gathering of any group for some public purpose. The word refers to the condition of being gathered together and to the gathered community. It translates very happily into the Latin congregatio and hence into the English congregation. Behind the word ecclesia lies the notion of being called out of some larger group in order to form this smaller public group with a definite purpose. The members of the ecclesia are then those called out and called together. The Christian ecclesia is then all those called out and called together by Jesus Christ to the glory of God and gathered together for worship. So it seems to go without saying that the fundamental meaning of ecclesia is then of a single calling together in God's service, in which itself there is no sense of hierarchy, priority, or ordering in ranks. In this respect, the word functions exactly as the Greek word laos, or people, in the phrase, actually not particularly common in the Hebrew Bible, the people of God. In fact, the word ecclesia is also sometimes used in the New Testament in the phrase ecclesia to theo, thus implying that there are other kinds of gatherings for quite other purposes. The development of the term laos from its original meaning as a whole people to the point where it designates those who have no particular office within the church is contested, especially the length of time that it took to get to the point of singling out the clergy from the laity. But pretty much everyone will agree that the earliest meaning of the term in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament is simply that of one people, or even of a large group of people. Jumping over 19 centuries for at least a few moments to Vatican II's Constitution on the Church, Lumen, Gentium, we can then see how particular and how deliberate is the clear preference in this document for the image of people of God to describe the church. The choice of the phrase is not arbitrary. It is a quite deliberate effort on the part of the Council Fathers to say, symbolized, of course, in placing the chapter on people of God before the chapter on the hierarchical nature of the church, that before we are many, we are one. There are certainly some interpreters of the Council, lately anyway, especially those who would like to reform the reform, as they say, who consider the image of communion to be more central than that of people of God. But communion, though certainly important, seems to me to mean, though we are many, we are one, and that it's not quite the same thing. So I would contrast a little bit there. People of God, before we are many, we are one, and communion, though we are many, we are one. If the ecclesia, or congregatio, is those called out and gathered together for a particular purpose, what exactly is the purpose? What is the purpose implied in the modifier of God, the people of God? What does it mean to be called out and gathered together for God's purpose? It surely cannot just be the gathering together that exhausts the purpose. If that were all it was, it would be like being issued with the team uniform but then left to stand around wondering if there was a game to be played. Yes, we're a team, but what are we a team for? What is the game we are involved in because we are on God's team? If we're simply waiting for Godot, then we have somehow missed the point. For much of its history, the Church has treated most of the team, the laity, as precisely waiting for Godot, though it has been asked to pass the time in a whole variety of exercises and duties, no doubt to stave off the dullness of merely waiting. Baptism was the moment when you received the uniform, symbolized today still by the white garment given to the newly baptized, as a sign that you had joined God's team. But the responsibilities that followed from your baptism were largely internal to the team. You had to keep the uniform clean, be kind to your teammates, obey the coach, and thank, praise, and bless God for admitting you to the team. Since you didn't or couldn't succeed in not besmirching the uniform, you had to do penance in order to get it clean again. You did all this sitting around, keeping clean, and doing penance for a lifetime, and with luck, your salvation was secure. But pretty much all ministry was in the hands of the clergy, and you didn't actually have to do very much. though there were a lot of things that you had not to do. The institutionalization of this passivity of the lay life, symbolized in its not being considered to be a particular calling or vocation, is a major consequence, or was a major consequence, of the 11th century Gregorian reform of the Church, under the influence of what Ghislain Lafont has called the Epistemology of Illumination. It is at that moment in history that hierarchy comes to be imagined as a sacred order of descending levels of power, in which knowledge and wisdom is passed down from higher to lower orders, and never in the opposite direction. Reflecting the Neoplatonic vision of Dionysius, the Church conceived of in this way is divided according to levels of power. Consequently, the laity, the lowest level, have no power at all, because there is no lower order in which to pass it along, to which to pass it along. In so many ways, this understanding of hierarchy has remained with the Church until the very recent past, and I think is reawakened in the increasingly strong efforts to reinterpret the message of Vatican II back into the mindset of this earlier time. Or as Kathy Kavanagh described it in the current issue of Commonweal, to read Vatican II through the 16th century Council of Trent. But Vatican II understood in a mysterious and perhaps inchoate way that the time had come for the Church to recognize the historically conditioned character of the Gregorian reform and bring itself into dialogue with a modern world in which hierarchy was not appreciated, aggiornamento, by going back behind that Gregorian reform to the primacy of spirit and charism that marked the Church of the first millennium, ressourcement, or return to the sources. This is evident both in the pastoral tone of the 16 documents that make up the paper record of the Council and in the major changes effected by the Council. Principal among them, of course, are the reform of the liturgy, the revised understanding of revelation, the image of the Church as the people of God, the interpretation of the authority of the bishop in sacramental rather than in jurisdictional terms, and the new understanding of the role of the laity. In this final respect, Vatican II put the seal on Yves Congar's observation that until there was an idea of the secular, there was no laity. One of the principal contributions of Vatican II was to return us to a richer understanding of baptism, which was achieved by restoring the idea of the baptismal priesthood to the Catholic Church. Before Vatican II, and even today, if you surveyed Catholics to ascertain what they saw to be central to their tradition, you would be unlikely to find many choosing the priesthood of all the baptized. In part, this is because the baptismal priesthood is not preached and not even taught much. In part, it is because the baptismal priesthood is the only priesthood that Luther recognized, and that fact was more than enough to consign it to the back burner of Catholic doctrine for several centuries. But its peculiar character is central to our coming to understand the one vocation, but many roles of the Catholic Church. In baptism, we are all incorporated into a priestly people. Most of us have heard that before, without thinking too much about what it might mean. So let's reflect for a few moments on the meaning of priestly in this context. The priesthood which is conferred on all of us in baptism is not directly connected to the ministerial or ordained priesthood, which has been so central to ministry in the Catholic Church for very many centuries. The connection is not to ministerial priesthood, but to the priesthood of Jesus Christ, the great high priest of the letter to the Hebrews. Traditionally, the ordained priest represents Christ at the altar. But we are a priestly people, and that includes all the ordained who have their ordained priesthood grafted onto a baptismal priesthood, which it does not replace. This priesthood, our baptismal priesthood, is not about presiding at the Eucharist or leading the community of faith, but rather about a life lived on the pattern of the life of Jesus Christ, though it has a liturgical component. Just as Christ stands between God and the world, reconciling them to one another, so the priestly people, who together are the sacrament of the presence of Christ in the world, stand in a reconciling role between God and the world. Priesthood, in the sense of baptismal priesthood, is about action. It cannot be passive, and it is not a matter of ontological change. Unless, of course, you think that the new creation we become in baptism is a matter of ontological change. To be a priestly people is to bring the cares of the world before God in the liturgy and to carry the grace and strength received there back out into the world that is also a place of grace and salvation. So the images I used a minute or two ago of baptism as donning a uniform with no further responsibilities are definitively abolished at Vatican II. Baptism is surely entry into a community, but it is into a community with a mission. We have the uniform in order to play the game. And like kids' soccer, everybody plays. Each of us, from the lowliest believer to the Pope himself, is baptized into mission. But what is the mission into which we have been baptized? I come back to that question. What is the game that goes with the uniform we have acquired? In essence, of course, it is to model our lives on Christ who came to serve, to sacrifice his life for the reconciliation of the world with God. Analogously, all Christians are called to the same responsibility. All Christians are other Christs. Our sacrifice will most probably not involve a criminal's death on a cross, but it will be a making holy, the root meaning of sacrifice, of our lives by giving them away. Other-centeredness is patterning our lives on Christ. Self-centeredness is not. One of Vatican II's most striking initiatives testifies to this insight and by implication links ordained and baptismal priesthood. That is a matter of looking at a little more closely than we usually do at Vatican II's reworking of the relationship between the bishop and the priest and comparing it to the calling of lay people. Before Vatican II, the priest was seen as the one with the fullness of orders, and the bishop was distinguished by his larger jurisdiction alone. Vatican II rethought the role of the bishop as the one with the fullness of orders, which meant, of course, that they could not simply be related to the power to consecrate the bread and wine. See, if the fullness of orders is explained in terms of the power to consecrate bread and wine, then it's very difficult to distinguish between the priest and the bishop, who at the altar do exactly the same thing. So instead, it explained the fullness of orders as a matter of Christian spiritual leadership, of being Christ for the local church. The priest who does precisely the same thing in presiding at Eucharist shares in the bishop's sacramental ministry to be Christ to the community, but to a smaller section of the community. In other words, he presides at Eucharist, bishop or priest, because he is the spiritual leader of the local church. He is Christ for that community. But lay mission and ministry is all about being Christ for the world, being the sacramental presence of Christ in the world that does not know him, being the leaven in the Mass. If the center of mission lies in a responsibility in the world, which all of us share in virtue of baptism, this has enormous consequences for our understanding of the respective roles of ordained and non-ordained Christians. To assert that the ordained are the only ones called to serve, or that they have a higher calling than the laity, is plain wrong. There is one calling to mission, entailed in baptism. But there may be many ways of living out this calling, and there is no justification for thinking of hierarchy as some kind of sliding scale of holiness or of the importance of the mission of one individual relative to another. As I said a little while ago, the hierarchical vision of Dionysius, in which only the higher can pass along grace, help, or power to the lower, and the lower can do nothing for the higher, lies at the back of the conception of the role of clergy relative to laity that has dominated Catholic understandings of ministry for at least the last 1,000 years. Hierarchy, as we have to see, as its root meaning, not as ordering, meaning, ranking in importance, but as ordering to mission. We are all ordered to mission. We all have our place in this hierarchy. Since being ordered to mission is a consequence of baptism, we are all equally, though differently, ordered to mission. As Cardinal Sunans, one of the great figures of Vatican II, once wrote, "The proudest moment in the life of a pope is not his consecration as pope or bishop or his ordination as a priest, but his baptism as a Christian." The understanding of mission has changed a lot in recent years because our understanding of the nature of the Church has been transformed. Above all, through the work of the Council Fathers of Vatican II and the theological experts who stood behind their work. Let me just quote one of my favorite passages from one of my favorite theologians, the French Dominican Yves Congar, who himself was an enormously influential figure at the council. "Final salvation," he wrote, "will be achieved by a wonderful refloating of our earthly vessel, rather than by a transfer of the survivors to another ship wholly built by God." Let me repeat that. "Final salvation will be achieved by a wonderful refloating of our earthly vessel, rather than by a transfer of the survivors to another ship wholly built by God." In saying this, he was breaking with many centuries of thinking in which the role of the Church in mission beyond itself was in the nature of a fishing expedition or a safari. How many souls can we capture for Christ? How many pagans can we save by baptizing them? How many can we bring into the sheepfold where there is safety and light and salvation, freeing them from the darkness and ignorance of their ways as Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and so on? These questions are now replaced by a simple, single query. How can we help the human world to come to a better knowledge of what human flourishing might be? St. Irenaeus famously wrote that the glory of God is the human being fully alive. How then can we aid human beings to be more fully alive, to live lives in which their full potential as human beings is explored? This is the challenge of mission in the modern world. The Church is best envisaged from the perspective of mission as a sacrament or a sign of the love of God in and for the world that works by performing the love of God in and for the world. Thus shall we, with God's help, wonderfully refloat our earthly vessel. 'Tis after all the world and not the church alone that God wills to save. So what are the particular responsibilities of the laity and the clergy relative to mission? While I for now do not like to use the terms clergy and laity, at the present time we have no obvious acceptable alternative short of using a negative to describe laity, the non-ordained, for example, and so we are stuck with them, these words. As maybe some of you have done in my classes occasionally, especially on the rare occasions when I've taught a course on the theology of the laity, I will tell my students that with the exception of doing the reading and writing the exams, there is only one task in this course, which is to come up with a one-sentence description of lay people which does not include the word not. It's extremely difficult to do. The clever ones avoid it and come up with a very good description of what a Christian is, which includes the clergy. But it is tough. I think a worldly apostle is about the best you can do. In the full and best sense of the word worldly, of course. Because we're all baptized and thus oriented to mission, and because there truly is only one mission, we're all called to mission, though not all to the same roles in mission. The role of the laity, whose lives are lived out in the secular world and who are to a high degree secular people, and this is not a slur, is to be in the front line, the vanguard of the Church's divine mandate to work towards a progressively more human world, to bring human flourishing closer, or if you like, to alert the world to the presence of divine grace in the world that is not the divine grace that is present in the church. Relative to this mission, it is accurate to refer to the clergy as support staff. Their primary responsibilities are for the health of the community of faith, whose raison d'etre is to give glory to God in worship and mission. The aforementioned Ghislain Lafont puts this very well when he says, and I quote, "The priest's mission is to stir up, verify, and coordinate these ministries in the church, and to gather them together in the unique sacrifice of Christ, whose mystery he proclaims personally in the homily." That's a very nice way of saying support staff. Here, I think, is the wisdom of John Paul II's occasional worries about the laicization of the clergy and the clericalization of the laity, though I'm not sure he was thinking so much about mission as about lifestyle and perhaps about the peculiar situation of those whom we refer to as lay ecclesial ministers. We'll come back to them in a few minutes. John Paul also went on record before his election to the papacy as believing that the central message of the Vatican Council was its statement that the two priesthoods differ in essence and not only in degree. While I do not believe this was the central point of Vatican II, I do see that it is important to establish that the two priesthoods are different, so that an ordained priest is not more a priest than the baptized layperson, but has added another form of priesthood to the baptismal priesthood which can never be set aside. Now, if we're going to make this claim about mission and about the respective responsibilities of the ordained and those who are not ordained, the worldly apostles, then what does this suggest about the traditional understandings of clergy as somehow ontologically changed by their ordination to the diaconate and the priesthood? Traditional, of course, is a term that often hides the fact that an idea or practice grew up for particular reasons in definite historical circumstances, and the so-called character theology of ordination is one of those cases. Lafont has written eloquently of how the Gregorian reform of the Church saw the sacramental character of ordination as a sacred instrumental power immanent to the person of the priest and indelible, and of how over time the focus shifted from the permanence of the instrumental power to the being of the priest himself, so that he became, and I quote Lafont, a Christian who existed on another ontological level than that defined by baptism and confirmation. I have to say, I've often wondered if we think of baptism as a new creation, which we are supposed to do according to Scripture, and therefore as an ontological change, you do have to wonder how many ontological changes a person can go through. This is something we have now lived with, this ontological distinction. This is something we have now lived with for almost 1,000 years, but this in itself does not mean that there's no other way to think of the role of ordination. What about the previous 1,000 years? I am not myself sure that the notion of the permanence of the instrumental power of the priest is any more essential to our understanding of priesthood than is the substantial ontological change that is traditionally supposed to occur at the moment of ordination. While it may be important that we think of some roles of the priest as inevitably, if not essentially, belonging to the office of the priest, once we remove the idea of substantial ontological change from our conception of ordination, it is hard to explain why a priest must necessarily be permanently a priest. And perhaps this is a value of ontological change, if we believe it to be a value to think of priesthood as a permanent state. Let me just suggest three classes of people that lead us, three classes of people who are not intrinsically connected to active priestly ministry, who force us to question what the meaning of this distinction between the ministry of the clergy and the ministry of the worldly apostles might add up to. So, three different groups of people. First, the situation of the resigned or former or laicized priest in the church today. These former priests may have gone through a canonical process that involves their telling phrase, reduction to the lay state. But they remain priests in the eyes of the church, technically, legally, canonically, and in some circumstances are obliged to act as priests. Aside from such extreme circumstances, however, their priesthood has been reduced to their ontological status, and the permanence of their instrumental power is permanently suspended. It is not unreasonable to ask what this all means. The reduction to the lay state of the former priest essentially makes him a hostage to the permanence of the priestly state, but at the same time it brings us back to the reflection on the issue of vocation. As a member of the baptismal priesthood, the vocation to Christian discipleship is neither removed nor altered by laicization, though the arena in which it will be exercised changes from that of the church internally to that of the church at work in the secular world. If we insist on continuing to call ordination to priesthood an ontologically irreversible condition, then we introduce a distinction in kind between the vocation to the lay life and the vocation to priesthood, and we are back with the fundamental understanding that leaves us once again with a cultic vision of priesthood. If we abide with the conviction that there is one Christian vocation but many ways of living it out, then we leave room for understanding priesthood without the language of ontological change. But in the present dispensation, we have priests who are permanently ontologically changed, other men with other callings who could in principle be admitted to the ranks of the ontologically changed, and women who, so they say, cannot or could not change ontologically. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but I can't resist repeating it. I recall some 40 years ago attending a lecture given by an old Catholic bishop, old capital O, old Catholic bishop at the seminary I was at those days in the backwoods of Oxfordshire, Heathrow Pontifical Athenaeum, Front Drive, 2.2 miles. And there was a priest, bishop giving a lecture on women in the church. And the climax of his lecture was the following statement: "So much at variance are the nature of woman and the nature of priesthood, that at the moment at which the first ordained woman attempted to consecrate the bread and wine, she would explode." I don't know whether he thinks he's been proved wrong or not, but anyway, he's gone to his reward long ago. So we have priests who are permanently ontologically changed, men who could be, and women who, so they say, cannot. And of course, those men, this is the laicized priests, and of course, those men who have been ontologically changed and remain so, but whose vocation is now to something other than that which the ontologically changed are called to. This is not a good picture. Second example. Another way to stretch the issue is to pay attention to the situation of the lay ecclesial minister. I recently wrote an article which I think summarizes the problem in its title. The title of the article is "The Lay Ecclesial Minister, Is She a Theological Monster?" When we think about the emerging phenomenon of lay ecclesial ministers, our first tendency is to compare them with the clergy whose roles they have increasingly taken over, if not exactly usurped. They certainly perform many of the functions that were more or less exclusively the responsibility of ordained priests in the not-so-distant past. They read the lessons at Mass or distribute communion. They run prayer groups and direct adult faith formation. They have charge over parishes with no resident priest. Full-time or part-time, paid or volunteer, they exercise ministerial functions within the local community of faith. When we see them in this light, the question that comes to mind is how their ministry stands relative to that of the ordained priest, much of whose work they are now doing. Particularly an issue, I think, for the pastoral associate who is leading a parish community in the absence of a permanent or resident priest, particularly if we go back to Lumen Gentium and see that the role of the bishop is described as the sacramental leader of the local church, the one who is Christ to the community, and the priest similarly, Christ to the somewhat smaller section of the local community as delegated by the bishop. And the pastoral associate seems to me to be exercising a role in the local community over which she may have charge, not different in essence from that being exercised by the ordained clergy. So, these lay ecclesial ministers, are they indeed mere stand-ins in what is in principle a temporary shortage of ordained clergy, or are they exercising a genuine ministerial calling? On the one side, the church cannot comfortably imagine that a shortage of ordained ministers ought to be or will be a permanent feature, which would suggest that lay ecclesial ministers in the form in which we know them would in some way be temporary. On the other hand, if their work is indeed a genuine ecclesial calling, it is hard to imagine the Spirit calling them to the ministry of temporary stand-in. Are they bench players, seeing, for whatever reason, rather more playing time than most would have expected? Or are they perhaps unknowing, maybe not so unknowing, precursors of a radical restructuring of the rules of the game? If by some miracle the numbers of traditional priestly vocations shot up, would the lay ecclesial ministers return meekly to the bench and exercise their waiting ministry of availability once again? And would the church expect that of them, even if, as is clearly the case, they mostly exercise their ministry commendably? If, on the other hand, there is no return to hordes of generously celibate young men offering themselves for the priesthood, at what point does the person from the bench become accepted as a genuine first-string player? It's equally important to look at these lay ecclesial ministers relative to the laity as a whole. It's when we take this step that we see that the various roles they exercise vis-a-vis the community, precisely because the rest of the laity do not take them up, are indeed genuine callings by the Spirit to specific ministries. But if this is true, then they are distinguished from the rest of the laity, just as they are distinct from traditional ordained ministers. Not yet clergy, not any longer laity. They live in some muddied middle realm, some twilight zone of priestly ambiguity, where their service to Christ's church, for all that it is often much appreciated, is frequently ill understood. Lay ecclesial ministers are part of the American Catholic parochial landscape, and it's increasingly true that the church cannot function without them. To some, they are the apostles of the second string. To others, they are heralds of a new conception of priestly ministry, which is the proper understanding of their role. A third test case for the value of notions of ontological change in the vocational relationship between ordained and worldly apostles is afforded by reflecting on the vowed life in a religious order. Traditionally, the church has used the language of vocation to refer to religious in precisely the way it is used to refer to ordained ministers. Yet their situations are different. Religious qua religious are not ordained, though in fact many of the male religious are. Religious are vowed to celibacy, while priestly ordination requires really only a promise to obey the law of celibacy of the Western Church and can be dispensed in some circumstances. The famous or notorious example of married Episcopalian priests, male ones, that is, who become Catholic and wish to continue to exercise their ministry. Yet it was the religious witness of celibacy that led eventually to the law of celibacy for the clergy. The way of life of the priest who is ontologically changed is in this respect, at least, patterned on the life of religious who are not ontologically changed. And here is the really difficult issue. Surely the vocation to religious life is similarly dramatic to that of the priest. And canonically, at least, it seems that with solemn vows there is a kind of permanence. Yet the vows can be dispensed, and the individual can return to lay life, and there is never any hint of substantial ontological change in the language surrounding religious profession. One of the more creative ways in which this whole question of ordained ministry has been addressed is by means of the concept of relationality. So, in their different ways, to mention just two, both Rick Gallardi and Ed Hanenberg have suggested we replace the idea of substantial ontological change with that of relational ontological change. Now, I have to confess, I don't know what relational ontological change means, and for me, it's the word ontological that creates the bigger problem rather than the word substantial. But I certainly think the shift to talking about relational is helpful. Essentially, the argument is that those who enter any form of ministry in the church are placed in a new relationship to the rest of the community of faith. So the woman who was a mother of four one day becomes the CCD teacher for fifth grade children, and those around her in the community now, to a degree, see the same person in a different light. The same relational change, or the same kind of relational change, happens to the one who enters ordained ministry, though obviously the change is more dramatic because the one who was not presiding at ministry and leading the community now is. In the church at present, this ordination is permanent, and doubtless that's the reason why the term relational ontological change has been substituted for substantial ontological change. Either way, it's an irreversible change in being, but at least the focus is on relationality and not on sacred power. Is the word ontological working here simply to protect permanence? Let me just summarize, and then I have a couple of more comments and we'll be done. So, summarize this argument that I've made so far. I've tried to suggest that the fundamental vocation of all Christians is the one calling to follow Christ by participating in the church as the sacrament of the presence of the love of God in the world. While there are many ways of fulfilling this one vocation, many roles within the church, it is difficult to make the case that one of these involves irreversible ontological change, while at least some of the others do not. And I've provided 3 examples of situations that test the coherence of the traditional approach to the clergy-laity distinction: the laicized priest, the lay ecclesial minister, and the vowed religious man or woman. So, a couple of suggestions for moving beyond what looks to me to be a kind of impasse. While it does not seem helpful to distinguish or relate the ways in which different people live out the one Christian vocation, the need for stability without absolute permanence, still more without ontological change, suggests revisiting the idea of different gifts or charisms. Just as the character theology that developed in the Middle Ages was an understandable and indeed valuable development for its times, so it might be that today we need to try something different, something which might suit the times better. It is a commonplace to observe that our times are allergic to permanence. People change occupations and locations much more than they used to, and transience has also affected both lifelong commitments to priestly ministry and, of course, to marriage. While this possibly temporary cultural shift is no reason to adjust church teachings to fit the times, it might be more productive to think about vocation less in the somewhat tarnished and abused category of permanence, and more by reflecting on the continuing respect our times seem to show for the notion of fidelity. Charisms seem to fit better into the category of fidelity than that of permanence. In Christian tradition, they're drawn first from the writings of St. Paul to the Corinthians, where he enumerates the many gifts or talents that individuals are given by God for their own personal development and for the good of the community. Evidently, our human and Christian fulfillment will be materially connected to faithfulness to our God-given gifts. The more we exercise our talents, the more we become the person we are, the one God wants us to be. If we have the gift of prophecy, then we must prophesy for the good of the community of faith. Similarly, if it is teaching or administration that is our personal strength. The test of the right use of these gifts is the foundational commandment to love. John Paul II himself, in words on the importance of freedom of speech in the church, makes this point about the prophetic voice. Criticism is useful in the community, he said in a general audience he gave in 1992. So useful in the community, which must always be reformed and must try to correct its own imperfections. In many cases, it helps the community to take a new step forward, but if it comes from the Holy Spirit, criticism must be animated by the desire to advance in truth and love. I think this pretty much corresponds to the way I would prefer to formulate the relationship between charisms and love. The roles we play in the church must be the way each of us acts in fidelity to the one vocation to be the sacrament of the love of God in the world. We must act in fidelity to our charisms because this is also our fidelity to ourselves. While fidelity to ourselves is the way we express our one Christian vocation, the self is no fixed thing. Here, I think Bernard Lonergan's work is particularly helpful. Because religion is about the relationship between God and the human person in the human community, says Lonergan, and I quote, any deepening or enriching of our apprehension of the human person possesses religious significance and relevance. Classically, he continues, the tradition understood the human person as a duality of body and soul. But today we add what he calls the richer and more concrete apprehension of the human person as incarnate subject. The old understanding of the human person as a fixed body-soul duality must give way to the much more dynamic vision of the human person that modernity has acquired above all through the human sciences. But if this is the case, then we may also have to begin to think about what it means to be faithful to ourselves, if ourselves themselves are understood in dynamic fashion, just as we have always had to pay attention to how to be faithful to a church in which the dynamic element has always been present in the guise of tradition. Understanding the human self more dynamically as an incarnate subject is not problematic for our fundamental commitment to the one Christian calling, since of its nature it is open to our growing in it and into it as time passes and our wisdom or our love grows. At any given moment in life, we commit ourselves in fidelity to the gospel's demands on us to particular ways of being Christian and being human. But since the I that I am is dynamic, there can be no final certainty that this way of being faithful will not eventually give way to some other way. As we grow in wisdom or holiness or the capacity to love, new talents and gifts may emerge, and others may wane as their usefulness to the self or the community of faith dissipates. Now, this picture could present the possibility of alarming fluidity in the ranks of ministers in the church as they slip from ministry to ministry, from charism to charism, as their needs for self-fulfillment, that lovely 60s word, are blamed on the Holy Spirit, and a dysfunctional transience comes to infect the community of faith. The issue, of course, is one of discernment. That is, of discerning how the one vocation to faithfulness to the gospel may need to be differently construed at different times in one's life. It is not self-fulfillment that is in question, but self-transcendence. Problems emerge if the contemplated change of roles is simultaneously a weakening of resolve in the self-transcendence of the one Christian vocation. But if marriage or ordination or religious life or any one of the ministerial callings any of us might have has become an exercise in the failure to transcend self to a point where it is irremediable, and this point must never be too quickly assumed to have arrived, then change must be contemplated, however painful. In the end, then, the test of the rightness of the roles we play in the church is their capacity to enable us in the one Christian vocation we all share. Because of our baptism and confirmation, we are all called to be the sacramental presence of the love of God in Christ for the world. The only question for each of us is just how we may best live that one vocation. Whether in the abstract one way is higher or better than another is not worth thinking about and has caused a lot of harm in the history of the church. For you or me, only one way is better. And that is what we have to find, or let it choose us, and live in fidelity to it. Which way is right for you or me is not something either of us can discern for the other. The only way is the way of self-transcendence, or as the gospel has it, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it cannot bear fruit. Thank you.